Do not accept free Bibles from strangers. That's the warning James Holbrook wishes someone had given him 3 years ago in Little Rock, Arkansas. What started as a polite gesture at a gas station ended with James staring into the face of God and spending every day since then praying he could forget what he saw. This is the true story of a man who finished a verse he should have left incomplete and discovered that some prayers get answered in the most devastating ways possible, because the preacher who gave him that Bible is still out there, still handing them out, still waiting for the next person to complete the verse and open a door that should never be opened. James Holbrook had been driving for 6 hours straight when he pulled into the gas station on the edge of Little Rock, Arkansas. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden hour that makes everything look peaceful and safe. He was 3 days into a cross-country drive, one of those solo trips people take when they need to clear their heads and figure out what comes next in life. James wasn't running from anything dramatic. No divorce, no tragedy, no crisis. He was just drifting, the way 34-year-old men sometimes do when they realise their life has become a series of routines they never consciously chose. The gas station was one of those older ones, the kind that still had a single attendant inside and handwritten signs advertising boiled peanuts and sweet tea. James filled his tank, stretched his legs, and headed inside to pay. That's when he saw the preacher. The man stood near the entrance, and there was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance. Middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing a simple button-down shirt and khakis. No clerical collar, no cross around his neck, nothing that screamed religious authority. But there was something about his stillness that made him noticeable. While everyone else in the gas station moved with purpose, grabbing snacks, pumping gas, checking phones, this man simply stood there, watching, with a leather-bound Bible tucked under his arm. Their eyes met and the preacher smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that came too easily, reached too wide. The kind of smile that made James's instincts whisper a quiet warning he chose to ignore. The preacher approached with slow, deliberate steps, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. He told James he couldn't help but notice he looked like a traveller, someone passing through. James confirmed he was just stopping for gas heading west, no particular destination in mind. The preacher nodded as if this answer satisfied something, then held out the Bible. He explained that he had too many Bibles, that he'd been given a whole box of them by his congregation, and he'd been handing them out to travellers and strangers for weeks now. He insisted James take it. It was a gift, he said. No strings attached, just the word of God, offered freely to anyone who might need it. James hesitated. He wasn't particularly religious, hadn't been to church since childhood, didn't own a Bible, didn't feel the lack of one in his life. But the preacher's eyes had a strange intensity behind that too wide smile, and James found himself taking the Bible out of pure politeness. It felt rude to refuse a man of God, even if James wasn't sure he believed in God anymore. The Bible was heavier than he expected. Old leather, worn at the corners, the kind of weight that came from decades of handling. It smelled like dust and paper, and something else James couldn't quite place, something faintly metallic like old pennies. James thanked the preacher and turned to leave, ready to toss the Bible in his backseat and forget about it. But then the preacher spoke again, and his words stopped James cold. The preacher told him there was a verse near the end of the Bible, and that James should read it when he had time. His exact words were careful, deliberate. Finish the verse, and you'll see God. The way he said it wasn't hopeful. It wasn't the warm promise of salvation that James associated with preachers and Sunday morning sermons. It was something else entirely. A warning disguised as a benediction, a threat wrapped in scripture. The preacher's smile never wavered, but his eyes, those knowing, too aware eyes, held something that made James's skin prickle with unease. James forced a polite nod, muttered another "thank you," and walked quickly back to his car. He tossed the Bible onto the passenger seat and pulled out of the gas station faster than necessary, his heart beating just a little too hard for a simple interaction with a stranger. He told himself he was being ridiculous. It was just a Bible, just a weird old preacher with poor social skills. Nothing to worry about. He'd throw it away at the next rest stop. But that night, alone in his motel room on the outskirts of Little Rock, James found himself picking up the Bible. He couldn't say why. Curiosity, maybe. Or boredom. The motel television only got 3 channels. all playing reruns he'd seen a dozen times. The Bible sat on the nightstand, and the preacher's words echoed in his mind. Finish the verse, and you'll see God. James opened the Bible and flipped toward the end, looking for whatever verse the preacher had meant. The pages were thin, delicate, covered in small print, and handwritten annotations from previous owners. Someone had underlined passages. Someone else had written notes in the margins, desperate prayers and half-formed thoughts. And then James found it. Near the very end of the book, in Revelation, he found the verse. Or rather, he found where the verse should have been. A page had been torn out, not carefully removed, not cleanly cut, violently ripped, leaving a jagged edge like a wound in the binding. The verse on the page before the missing one ended mid-sentence, and the verse on the page after picked up somewhere else entirely, leaving a gaping hole in scripture. James's hands trembled as he examined the torn edge. It looked deliberate, desperate. Someone had ripped this page out in a hurry, or in a panic, or in some moment of terrible understanding. The jagged paper felt rough under his fingertips, and that metallic smell grew stronger, though James couldn't explain why. He read the incomplete verse aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the empty motel room. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in." But the rest was gone, ripped away. Whatever came after, "I will come in," existed only on that missing page, and James felt a sudden, overwhelming need to know what those words were. The moment he spoke the verse aloud, something changed. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like the atmospheric pressure had shifted. The silence became absolute in a way that made James acutely aware of his own breathing, his own heartbeat. For just a moment he could have sworn he heard something outside his motel room door. A soft sound, like someone shifting their weight, waiting. James looked at the door. It was locked, chain in place, deadbolt engaged, nothing there. He shook his head, told himself he was being paranoid, and set the Bible back on the nightstand. But sleep didn't come easily that night. When he finally drifted off sometime after 2 a.m, James dreamed. He dreamed of knocking. Slow, methodical knocks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. 3 knocks, then silence. Then 3 more knocks, slightly louder. Then 3 more, louder still. The knocking grew and grew until it filled his entire consciousness, until he couldn't tell if the sound was outside his door or inside his own skull. James woke with a gasp, drenched in cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The motel room was dark and quiet. No knocking. No sound at all except the hum of the air conditioning unit. But the Bible sat on his nightstand, and in the dim light filtering through the curtains, James could have sworn it was closer than where he'd left it. Just a few inches. Maybe he'd bumped the nightstand in his sleep. Maybe it had shifted on its own. Morning came with harsh sunlight and the clarity of day. James showered, dressed, packed his things. He told himself he was leaving Little Rock, continuing west, getting back on the road and forgetting about the strange preacher and his torn Bible. He picked up the Bible to throw it in the trash can by the door. His hands began to shake, violently, uncontrollably, like his body was rejecting the very idea of letting it go. The Bible slipped from his trembling fingers and fell to the floor, landing open to that incomplete verse. "I will come in." Come in where? Come in how? What came after those words? Why had someone torn out that page? What was James supposed to finish? Questions circled his mind like vultures, and James realised with creeping horror that he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he knew. He picked up the Bible with shaking hands, set it carefully on the passenger seat of his car, and drove to the Little Rock Public Library. James told himself he'd leave Little Rock that morning, but the Bible had other plans for him. The Little Rock Public Library became James's entire world within 24 hours of that first morning. He told himself it would be just one day of research, a few hours to satisfy his curiosity about the incomplete verse, figure out what the missing page had said, and then he'd be back on the road by sunset. One day, that was all. But one day became 2, then 3. Then a week slipped by like water through his fingers. James set up camp in the library's theology section, surrounded by different translations of the Bible. King James Version, with its archaic language and poetic rhythm. New International Version with its modern clarity. English Standard Version. The Latin Vulgate, Greek translations, Hebrew texts. He photographed the incomplete verse, posted it on religious forums online, asked scholars and theologians if they knew of any variation in that specific passage from Revelation. Every evening he returned to his motel room with a new translation, a new possibility. He'd sit on the edge of his bed with the torn Bible open in his lap and whisper the words aloud, trying different versions, different phrasings, different completions to that severed sentence. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me." That was the standard King James completion. Nothing happened. He tried the NIV. "I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." Nothing. The ESV, the New American Standard, the Message, the Amplified Bible. Each night, James spoke a different version into the silence of his motel room, and each night, absolutely nothing happened. No divine presence, no revelation, no answer. But the dreams got worse. The knocking that had started that first night intensified. Now James dreamed of doors, endless hallways filled with identical doors, all closed, all waiting. In the dreams, he walked down these hallways, and behind every door, he could hear something breathing, waiting, listening for him. The knocking would start, 3 deliberate knocks from behind one door, then another, until the entire hallway thundered with the sound of something trying to get in, or trying to get him to let it in. He'd wake gasping, disoriented, the echo of knocking still ringing in his ears, even after he opened his eyes to the mundane reality of his motel room. Other dreams were worse. He dreamed of standing at the edge of an enormous void, a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. And from somewhere in that infinite emptiness, a voice would ask him the same question over and over. "Why did you call me? Why did you say my name?" But James had never said any name. He'd only spoken that incomplete verse. During the day, things weren't much better. James stopped answering his phone. His boss called repeatedly. James had been scheduled to return to work a week ago. He let it go to voicemail. His friends texted and worried about his sudden silence. He ignored them. His landlord left increasingly angry messages about missed rent. None of it seemed to matter. The only thing that felt real, that felt urgent, was figuring out what that missing page had said. Food lost all flavour. James would force himself to eat because his body demanded it, but everything tasted like cardboard and ash. Sleep became fragmented, a series of brief unconscious moments between the nightmares and the waking obsession. He lost weight. His eyes developed dark circles that made him look perpetually exhausted, which he was. And he felt watched. It started subtly, a prickling at the back of his neck while he researched in the library. The sense that someone was staring at him from just outside his peripheral vision. But every time he'd turn to look, there'd be no one there, or there'd be other library patrons, but none of them paying him any attention. His reflection in mirrors started to unnerve him. Just for split seconds, for the briefest fragments of time, his reflection would look wrong. Eyes too wide, pupils too dilated, smile too broad, stretching his face in ways that shouldn't be possible. He'd blink, and his reflection would be normal again, just a tired man staring back at himself. But those moments accumulated, building a deep unease that never quite left him. Then James started noticing the pattern, and everything got so much worse. He was sitting in a diner on his 9th day in Little Rock, forcing down eggs that tasted like nothing, when he saw the woman at the counter. She had a Bible next to her coffee cup, leather-bound, worn at the edges, the exact same Bible James had been given. His heart began to race. He watched as she read it, her hands trembling slightly, her lips moving as if she were praying or reciting something silently to herself. When she left, James followed at a distance and saw her get into a car with an out-of-state license plate. A traveller, just like him. The next day, James saw another one. A man in his 50s sitting on a bench outside the library, clutching the same leather Bible with white-knuckled intensity. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow, the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. James recognised that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror that morning. Then another Bible, abandoned in the motel hallway outside James's room. Same leather cover, same worn texture. He picked it up, flipped through it with shaking hands and found it. The torn page, the incomplete verse, exactly like his. How many of these Bibles were out there? How many people had the preacher given them to? And what had happened to all those people? James needed answers. He needed to find someone who knew something about these Bibles, about that preacher, about what was happening to him. He started asking questions around Little Rock, showed people the Bible at gas stations, at restaurants, at shops. Most people glanced at it and shook their heads, uninterested. But a very few, reacted differently. Their faces would go pale. They'd take a step back. One woman saw the Bible and immediately made the sign of the cross before hurrying away. Finally, at a gas station on the west side of town, James approached a local filling up his truck. The man was probably in his 40s, weathered face, work-worn hands. James asked him if he'd ever seen a preacher handing out Bibles like the one James held. The man's face drained of every drop of colour. For a moment, he just stared at James with naked fear in his eyes. Then he leaned in close and James could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. But underneath that was something else. The sharp, acrid smell of genuine terror. The man's voice came out choked and desperate when he told James not to finish the verse. Just those words, barely whispered. Don't finish the verse. Then, before James could ask what he meant, before James could beg for more information, the man practically ran to his truck. He peeled out of the gas station so fast his tyres squealed on the pavement, and James was left standing there, holding the Bible, more desperate and confused than ever. 2 weeks in Little Rock, 14 days since James had accepted that Bible from the soft-spoken preacher. His entire life had imploded in slow motion. He'd gotten an email from his boss informing him he no longer had a job. His landlord had sent a certified letter about eviction proceedings. His car had a bright yellow boot on the front wheel from accumulated parking tickets he'd never paid. His savings account was nearly empty from 2 weeks of motel fees and barely eating. None of it registered as important. The Bible was the only thing that felt real. Everything else was just background noise, meaningless static in a life that had narrowed to a single, all-consuming focus. What did that missing page say? James was gaunt by then, hollow-eyed, consumed by an obsession he could no longer control or even fully understand. He'd stopped trying different translations. They weren't working. He needed someone who'd actually dealt with this Bible before, someone who knew its secrets. That's when he found the elderly woman. She was at a small church on the outskirts of Little Rock, sitting in a back pew, praying. James had gone there out of desperation, thinking maybe a church would have answers about the strange Bible. When he showed it to the woman, her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her entire body went rigid, and her eyes, her eyes, filled with a terror so ancient and deep, it seemed to age her another decade, right there in front of him. But she didn't run. Instead, she agreed to talk. Her voice was frail, barely above a whisper, but her eyes burned with something that looked like a warning and a plea and a terrible, terrible knowledge all at once. She told James she'd had that Bible 40 years ago. The same Bible, or one exactly like it, given to her by the same soft-spoken preacher who never seemed to age. She'd been young then, curious, faithful. She'd finished the verse. When James begged to know what happened after she completed it, the woman reached out and gripped his hands. Her fingers dug into his skin, hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to hurt, and she pulled him close until their faces were inches apart. She whispered that she'd seen God, and that she'd been praying for blindness ever since. Every single day for 40 years, she'd prayed to go blind, to unsee what she'd seen. But God, in his cruelty, or his mercy, or his indifference, had never granted that prayer. The woman wouldn't elaborate on what she'd witnessed. She couldn't, she said. Words weren't sufficient. Human language had no way to describe what existed on the other side of that completed verse. But she told James something else, something that made his blood run cold. She explained that the missing page wasn't missing by accident. Someone had torn it out deliberately. Someone who'd finished the verse before her. Someone who'd seen what she'd seen, and who'd tried desperately to save the next person by removing the true ending. The page contained the real completion of the verse, the true name, the actual invitation. The woman's grip on James's hands tightened until he thought his bones might crack. She begged him with everything she had left. Burn the Bible. Leave Little Rock tonight. Don't speak another verse. Don't even think the words, just destroy it and run and never look back. James left that church fully intending to do exactly what she'd said. He drove back to his motel with the Bible on the passenger seat, And this time, he was really going to get rid of it. He was going to burn it in the motel parking lot and then drive until he hit the ocean and never think about Little Rock or torn pages or incomplete verses ever again. He held the Bible over the metal trash can in his motel room. His hands moved to tear the pages, to destroy it once and for all. But his body refused. His hands began to shake violently, his arms locked up, and no matter how hard he tried, he physically could not make himself damage or discard the Bible. It was as if his body was no longer entirely his own, as if something else had begun to guide his actions, and that something wanted him to keep the Bible, needed him to keep it. James set the Bible back on the nightstand with trembling hands and collapsed onto the bed. And for the first time, since accepting that cursed gift, he began to cry. But James wasn't done with the Bible. And the Bible wasn't done with him. 3 weeks in Little Rock, Arkansas. 21 days since James Holbrook had accepted a Bible from a soft-spoken preacher at a gas station. 21 days that had stripped away everything that made him human and left behind only obsession wearing the skin of a man. James stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror and barely recognised himself. He'd lost nearly 20 pounds. His cheekbones jutted out sharp enough to cast shadows on his face. His eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, ringed with dark circles that made him look like he'd aged a decade. His hair was greasy, unwashed. His hands trembled constantly now, a fine tremor that never stopped. He looked like a cancer patient in the final stages. He looked like someone dying. Maybe he was. His savings account showed a balance of $73. Everything else had been drained by motel fees, by the parking tickets he'd never paid, by the boot on his car that he couldn't afford to remove, by the food he barely ate. His credit cards were maxed out. His phone had been disconnected for non-payment. His apartment in the city he'd left behind had been emptied by his landlord, and his belongings put in storage that he'd never be able to afford to retrieve. None of it mattered. Not his job, not his home, not his savings, not his health. The verse was all that existed, the incomplete verse that looped endlessly in his mind, that whispered through his dreams, that had become the singular focus of his entire existence. That night, at his absolute lowest point, James sat on the edge of the motel bed with the Bible in his lap. The leather felt warm under his hands, warmer than it should be, almost like it was alive. He'd been holding it so much over the past 3 weeks that the cover had moulded to his grip, worn smooth in exactly the places where his fingers always rested. James did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed, but he didn't pray to God. He'd stopped believing in the God of churches and comfort weeks ago. Instead, he prayed to the Bible itself. He spoke to it like it was a living thing, because by then he was certain it was. His voice came out cracked and broken when he told the Bible he didn't know what it wanted him to say. He'd tried every translation, every variation, every possible completion he could find. He didn't know how to finish the verse. His voice broke completely when he begged it to just show him, to please help him understand. And then, in a moment of complete desperation and surrender, James whispered that he'd do anything. Anything at all. Just please let him finish it. Silence answered him. The motel room held its breath. The air conditioning unit stopped its eternal hum. The distant sound of traffic on the highway faded to nothing. Even James's own breathing seemed to stop, suspended in a moment that stretched and stretched until it felt like time itself had paused. Then words entered his mind. They didn't come from outside. They appeared directly in his consciousness, bypassing his ears entirely, manifesting as pure understanding. Not English. Not any earthly language James had ever heard. The sounds, if they could even be called sounds, scraped against the edges of human comprehension. They were guttural and clicking and harmonic all at once, syllables that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, phonemes that human vocal cords were never meant to produce. But James understood them, perfectly, completely. They felt ancient, older than civilization, older than humanity, older than the earth itself. They felt inevitable, like they'd been waiting since the beginning of time for someone to speak them. They felt true, in a way that nothing else in James's life had ever felt true. His mouth opened on its own. He had no conscious control over it. His jaw moved in ways that sent pain shooting through his skull. His tongue contorted into shapes it wasn't designed to make. And the sounds that emerged from his throat weren't his voice. The verse completed itself through him. The words tore out of James's mouth like they were being ripped from somewhere deep inside his soul. Guttural clicks that made his throat bleed. Harmonics that resonated in his chest cavity and made his ribs vibrate. Syllables that seemed to fold space around them as they were spoken. The sounds shredded his vocal cords, left the taste of copper and salt in his mouth, but he couldn't stop. The verse demanded completion, and his body had become nothing more than a vessel for words that predated human language. The final syllable left his lips, and the world went catastrophically wrong. Not quiet, not silent in the normal sense, silent in a way that shouldn't be possible. Every sound in the universe stopped. The hum of electricity in the walls cut off instantly. The distant traffic on the highway vanished. The sound of his own heartbeat disappeared. James couldn't hear his own breathing even though he could feel his chest moving. Sound itself had been erased from reality. The motel room existed outside of time, suspended in a void of absolute nothingness. The air felt thick, viscous, like James was breathing liquid. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilised at a dimmer level that cast everything in sickly yellow shadows. The walls seemed farther away than they should be, and simultaneously too close, as if the room's dimensions had become negotiable. James tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed back onto the bed, the Bible falling from his hands to the floor. His mouth was full of blood from his torn vocal cords. His entire body shook uncontrollably. Then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the motel room door. Knock, knock, knock. Each impact was impossibly loud in the absolute silence, loud enough to make James's teeth rattle, loud enough to send vibrations through the floor and up into his bones. But at the same time, the knocks didn't disturb the silence at all. They existed inside it, part of it, a sound that was somehow also the absence of sound. James's blood turned to ice water in his veins. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. He hadn't called anyone. He hadn't ordered food or service. The motel staff never came by this late. And even if they had, they wouldn't knock like that. Nobody knocked like that. Something was outside his door. Something he'd invited. Something that had been waiting. Decades, centuries, maybe since the beginning of time itself. For someone to finish that verse. Every instinct James possessed screamed at him not to move, to stay frozen on the bed, to never acknowledge those knocks. But his body began moving anyway, operating on some compulsion he couldn't control. His legs straightened. His feet found the floor. He stood swaying and began walking toward the door. Each step felt like moving through concrete. His muscles fought against the movement, but something stronger than his will propelled him forward. The door grew larger as he approached, impossibly tall, the peephole becoming an enormous black circle that seemed to contain entire universes of darkness. The knocking came again. 3 deliberate impacts that shook the door in its frame. James's hand reached out without his permission. His fingers wrapped around the door handle. The metal was ice cold, cold enough to burn, cold enough that his skin stuck to it. Every cell in his body screamed warnings, flooded his system with adrenaline and pure animal terror, begged him to stop, to let go, to not open that door under any circumstances. But he'd already completed the verse. The invitation had already been spoken. The door would open whether James wanted it to or not. His body was no longer entirely his own. Something else guided his actions now, something that had been waiting on the other side of that incomplete verse, for someone foolish or desperate or faithful enough to finish it. James's hand turned the handle. The deadbolt disengaged with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The chain lock slid free. The door swung open, hinges groaning. Nothing. The motel parking lot stretched out before him, empty except for a few scattered cars and his own vehicle with its bright yellow boot still locked to the wheel. A single streetlight flickered in the distance, casting pools of sickly, orange light on the cracked pavement. The night air was cool and still. No wind, no movement, no figure waiting outside his door. For one beautiful, naive, desperately hopeful heartbeat, relief flooded through James. It had been nothing, just his imagination, just the accumulated stress and sleeplessness and obsession playing tricks on his mind. There was nothing there. He was alone. He was safe. Then James felt it. The presence wasn't outside the door. It was behind him, inside the room. It had been there the entire time, waiting for him to open the door, not to let it in, but to let it reveal itself. The door hadn't been a barrier. The door had been symbolic. The real door was the verse, and James had opened that the moment he'd spoken those ancient, terrible words. Every hair on James's body stood on end. His skin erupted in goosebumps so severe they hurt. The temperature in the room plummeted so fast his breath came out in visible clouds. And slowly, more slowly than anything had ever moved in the history of the world, James began to turn around. James turned slowly, every muscle in his body screaming resistance, every nerve firing warnings that his brain could no longer process. The movement took an eternity. Each degree of rotation stretched into infinity, time dilating and compressing simultaneously until James couldn't tell if he was moving at all or if the room was rotating around him while he stood frozen in place. At first there was nothing visible, just his motel room, the unmade bed with its cheap floral comforter, the nightstand with the lamp casting sickly yellow light, the painting of a lighthouse bolted to the wall, the bathroom door standing half open. Everything exactly where it had been. But the air was wrong. Physics had broken down. The space inside the room felt simultaneously too vast and too crushingly small, as if the walls were miles away and pressing against James's skin at the same time. Perspective became negotiable. The corner where two walls met bent at an angle that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The ceiling receded upward into impossible distance, while also bearing down with claustrophobic weight. Geometry itself had become a suggestion rather than a law. James's eyes hurt, not from brightness or darkness, but from trying to process spatial relationships that human vision wasn't designed to comprehend. His brain struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, kept trying to force the room back into normal Euclidean space. But reality refused to cooperate. The dimensions were wrong. All of them. Height, width, depth, and others that didn't have names because they shouldn't exist in the physical world. And then James saw it. Not a figure, not a being, not anything with shape or form or substance in any way he could articulate, but presence, vast beyond any scale of measurement, existing in dimensions his eyes weren't built to process. It occupied the space in the room, but also the space outside the room, and the space between spaces, and spaces that existed only in theoretical mathematics. It was there and everywhere and nowhere all at once. The presence didn't have a body. It didn't have features or characteristics or anything James could point to and say that's what it looks like. But he perceived it anyway, understood its existence with a certainty that bypassed normal sensory input entirely. It registered in his consciousness not as something seen but as something known, the way you know you exist without needing to see yourself. It wasn't evil. That was the first thing James understood with crushing clarity. The presence contained no malice, no cruelty, no desire to harm. But it also wasn't good, not in any way that would bring comfort to a human heart. It was utterly, horrifyingly, devastatingly divine. This was God, not the God of Sunday morning services and children's prayers and comforting hymns, not the God who answered wishes and healed the sick and offered eternal reward for earthly suffering, not the God of mercy and love and salvation that James had heard about in church as a child and dismissed as fairy tales as an adult, but the God beneath all that, the vast, infinite, incomprehensible creator that had set existence in motion and watched it unfold with the cold precision of mathematics. The thing that had built the universe on rules that had nothing whatsoever to do with human concepts of right and wrong, good and evil, suffering and joy. The intelligence, if it could even be called intelligence, that operated on scales of time and space so enormous that humanity's entire existence from beginning to end was less than a single neuron firing in a cosmic brain. And it was looking at James, through James, into every moment of his existence simultaneously. Past, present and future collapsed into a single point of agonizing awareness. James saw himself as an infant, as a child, as a teenager, as a man. He saw himself dying, saw the moment of his death and the infinite nothing that would follow. He saw every choice he'd ever made and every choice he would make and every choice he could have made in alternate timelines that branched off into infinity. He saw himself from the outside, from angles that shouldn't exist, from perspectives that showed him as a collection of atoms, as a pattern of electrical impulses, as a temporary arrangement of matter that thought it was important. The presence perceived him completely. Not just his physical form, but his thoughts, his memories, his fears, his hopes, his DNA, his quantum states. Every single particle that composed his body and every single moment of consciousness he'd ever experienced. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was private. James existed as an open book, completely transparent, every page laid bare and read simultaneously. The weight of that perception was unbearable. James's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees on the motel room floor, but not in worship. His body simply stopped functioning under the weight of being perceived by something so vast, so utterly beyond him, that the mere fact of its attention was enough to overwhelm every system keeping him alive. His heart stuttered. His lungs forgot how to breathe. His brain began to shut down non-essential functions in a desperate attempt to process what was happening to him. The presence didn't speak in words. It didn't need to. It spoke in knowing, in direct transmission of understanding that bypassed language entirely and wrote itself directly into James's consciousness. And James understood. He'd asked to see God. The verse had been answered. This was what he'd wanted, what he'd obsessed over for 3 weeks, what he'd sacrificed his entire life to achieve. He'd finished the verse, and God had come. The presence began to show him things, not with images or visions, but with pure understanding that exploded in his mind like stars going supernova. James saw the true nature of reality. The universe wasn't a place of meaning or purpose. It was a mathematical equation solving itself through the medium of physical law. Galaxies formed and died, not because there was beauty in their creation, but because gravity and thermodynamics demanded they form and die. Stars burned not to give light, but because fusion was inevitable when hydrogen compressed under sufficient mass. Planets formed not to host life, but because debris accreted around gravitational wells. Life emerged not because it was special, but because self-replicating molecules were statistically probable, given enough time and enough chemical interactions. Humans were accidents. Beautiful, complex, conscious accidents, but accidents nonetheless. There was no grand plan, no divine purpose, no destiny written in the stars. Humanity had emerged through blind evolutionary processes on an unremarkable planet, orbiting an average star in a galaxy that was one of trillions in an observable universe that might itself be one of infinite universes in a multiverse that had no beginning and no end. James saw the insignificance of human suffering in the face of cosmic scale. Every pain he'd ever felt, every heartbreak, every loss, every moment of anguish that had seemed so important at the time. All of it was noise, static, meaningless fluctuations in the experiences of beings who existed for less than a cosmic eye blink. The Holocaust, the Black Death, every war, every genocide, every instance of human cruelty and suffering throughout all of history. From the perspective of the universe, they were nothing, less than nothing, rounding errors in the grand calculation of existence. The universe didn't care about suffering because the universe wasn't capable of caring. Caring was a human emotion, evolved to help social primates survive and reproduce. Projecting that emotion onto the cosmos was like expecting a mathematical equation to feel sympathy. It was category error, elevated to the level of theology. James saw the meaninglessness of morality when measured against infinity. Good and evil were human constructs, useful fictions that societies created to function, but fictions nonetheless. The universe operated on physics, not ethics. An earthquake that killed thousands wasn't evil. It was continental plates releasing tension. A virus that ravaged populations wasn't malicious. It was proteins replicating according to their chemical nature. A predator that tore apart prey wasn't cruel. It was an organism obtaining nutrients necessary for survival. Humans had invented morality because consciousness made them aware of their own suffering and capable of empathizing with the suffering of others. But that invention was local, temporary, confined to one species on one planet for the brief moment of that species' existence. In the grand scope of cosmic history, morality would appear and disappear like a candle flame in an infinite darkness, noticed by nothing and mourned by no one. James saw the cold, beautiful, terrible truth that the universe didn't care. It couldn't care. Care required consciousness, and while the universe might have given rise to consciousness on countless worlds across its vast expanse, the universe itself was not conscious. It was process without awareness, pattern without intention. Complexity emerging from simplicity, not because complexity was the goal, but because given infinite time and infinite space, complexity was inevitable. Every prayer ever prayed had been words shouted into an indifferent void. Not because God was cruel and chose not to answer, but because the thing humans called God, this vast, incomprehensible presence that James now perceived, wasn't the kind of entity that answered prayers. It wasn't personal. It wasn't involved. It had set the initial conditions of existence and watched those conditions unfold according to immutable laws, no more capable of intervention than a mathematician could reach into an equation and change the value of pi. Mercy was a human invention, created because humans had mirror neurons and theory of mind and the capacity to imagine themselves in another's suffering. Love was a chemical reaction, oxytocin and dopamine and neural pathways reinforced through repeated, positive interactions. Meaning was something people created to avoid staring into the void of purposelessness, to give themselves reasons to continue existing in a universe that would exist just fine without them. Every layer of comfortable delusion that humans wrapped themselves in to make existence bearable was stripped away. Every lie people told themselves about cosmic justice, about karma, about divine plans, about everything happening for a reason. All of it exposed as exactly what it was. Stories told to children who were terrified of the dark. James saw every prayer he'd ever prayed as a child revealed for what it was. Words spoken to an empty room by a confused ape who'd evolved enough intelligence to fear death, but not enough to cope with the certainty of oblivion. He saw every hope he'd ever held exposed as denial, every dream revealed as fantasy, every moment of joy understood as nothing more than neurons firing in patterns. That felt good because feeling good aided survival. He saw God, and God was real. God existed. But God was nothing like what humans had imagined. God wasn't a father, wasn't a judge, wasn't a being at all in any sense that human language could capture. God was the fundamental substrate of reality itself, the quantum foam from which existence emerged, the mathematical necessity that gave rise to something rather than nothing. God was real, and present, and infinite. And that was so much worse than if God had never existed at all. Because an absent God could be doubted, a silent God could be questioned, but a present God who was utterly indifferent, who existed at scale so vast that human suffering didn't even register as notable, that God destroyed faith more thoroughly than any atheist argument ever could. James wept, not from sadness, though grief was certainly part of what flooded through him, not from fear, though terror was absolutely present in the cocktail of emotions overwhelming his system. He wept from the unbearable burden of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could never be unknown, the kind of truth that destroyed the person who learned it. His tears fell on the cheap motel carpet, and each tear contained the death of a comfortable illusion. He cried for the God he'd thought existed as a child. He cried for the meaning he'd thought life possessed. He cried for the importance he'd thought humanity held in the cosmic order. He cried for every beautiful lie that made existence tolerable, all of them burning away in the presence of a truth so absolute it allowed no room for comforting ambiguity. The presence remained, patient, eternal. Unconcerned with James's breakdown because James's breakdown was as cosmically insignificant as his birth had been, as his life was, as his death would be. The presence had shown him what he'd asked to see. The verse had been completed. The prayer had been answered. James had wanted to see God, and God had obliged. And now James would spend whatever remained of his life knowing exactly what he'd seen, carrying that knowledge like a wound that would never heal, understanding truths that humans were never meant to understand, because humans had evolved to survive and reproduce, not to comprehend the fundamental nature of reality. The presence began to fade, not because it was leaving, but because James's mind could no longer sustain the perception of it. His consciousness was collapsing under the weight of what it had been forced to process. The motel room slowly reasserted its normal dimensions. Physics remembered how to behave. Geometry became Euclidean again. But James knew that the presence hadn't actually gone anywhere. It had always been there, would always be there, pervading every atom of existence. He just lacked the capacity to perceive it anymore. which was the closest thing to mercy he would ever receive. James collapsed fully onto the floor, his body curled into a fetal position, his eyes open but unseeing, his mind shattered into fragments that would never quite fit back together the way they had before. He'd finished the verse, he'd seen God, and he would never, ever be able to unsee what had been revealed. What James didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that morning would come, and with it, a choice more terrible than anything he'd faced so far. Morning came the way morning always does. Indifferent to the horrors of the night before, sunlight crept through the gap in the motel curtains and fell across James Holbrook's collapsed form on the floor. He lay curled in a fetal position, eyes open but completely vacant, staring at something no one else could see. Tears had dried on his cheeks in salt-crusted trails. His breathing was shallow but steady. His heart beat with mechanical regularity. By every medical definition, he was alive. But something fundamental was gone. The motel maid found him at 9:30 in the morning. When she came to clean the room, she knocked first, got no answer, used her master key, and pushed open the door to find James lying there on the stained carpet. For a horrible moment, she thought he was dead. Then she saw his chest rising and falling, saw his eyes tracking something invisible across the ceiling, and realised this might be worse than death. She called the front desk. The manager called 911. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, their equipment clattering as they rushed into the room and knelt beside James. They checked his vitals, shined lights in his eyes, asked him questions he didn't answer. His pulse was 72 beats per minute. His blood pressure was slightly elevated but within normal range. His pupils reacted to light. His reflexes worked. Every physical indicator suggested he was fine. But James wouldn't speak, wouldn't blink, wouldn't respond to his own name. He just stared with those hollow, devastated eyes at something that existed beyond the motel room ceiling, beyond the sky, beyond the observable universe itself. The paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher and transported him to the nearest hospital. Doctors ran tests. CT scans showed no brain damage. Blood work came back normal. EEGs indicated regular brain activity. Physically, James Holbrook was completely healthy. Mentally, something had shattered so completely that the pieces no longer fit together. He stayed in the hospital for 3 days, lying in a bed in the psychiatric ward, staring at nothing. Nurses tried to feed him. Sometimes he ate, mechanically chewing and swallowing without seeming to taste anything. Sometimes he didn't. Psychiatrists came to evaluate him. They asked questions. James didn't answer. They diagnosed him with catatonia brought on by acute psychological trauma, though none of them could identify what trauma might have caused such a complete break from reality. On the 3rd day, James began to move again, slowly, as if remembering how his body worked. He sat up in bed. He ate breakfast when it was brought to him. He responded to simple questions with single-word answers. Yes, no, fine. Nothing that gave any insight into what had happened to him, but enough to convince the hospital staff that he was improving. The truth was that James wasn't improving. He was just learning how to function while carrying knowledge that no human mind was designed to hold. He was learning how to move and speak and exist while seeing reality stripped of every comforting illusion that made life bearable. He was learning how to be alive while being fundamentally, irreversibly broken. James checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. He could walk now, though his gait was slow and unsteady like someone learning to use their legs for the first time. He could dress himself, though it took him 20 minutes to figure out how buttons worked. He could speak, though his voice came out flat and emotionless, every word requiring conscious effort to produce. The hospital staff tried to convince him to stay longer, to give them time to help him. James looked at them with those hollow eyes and told them there was no help for what he had. They reluctantly let him leave after making him promise to follow up with outpatient psychiatric care, a promise James had no intention of keeping. He returned to his motel room. The Bible was still there on the floor where it had fallen when James completed the verse. He picked it up with trembling hands, opened it to the torn page, and stared at the jagged edge for a long time. Then he put the Bible in his car and began to drive. James didn't leave Little Rock. He couldn't. Not yet. Not when he knew the preacher was still out there, still handing out Bibles with missing pages, still waiting for the next desperate or curious or faithful person to complete the verse. James had to warn people. He had to try to save whoever he could from making the same catastrophic mistake he'd made. He sold what little he had left: his laptop, his watch, his phone, though it had already been disconnected for non-payment. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him in cheap motels for a while longer, enough to buy the bare minimum of food to keep his body functioning. Then James began his vigil. He stationed himself outside gas stations around Little Rock, the same ones where he'd seen other people with the torn Bibles. He stood in parking lots, holding his own Bible like a warning sign, approaching travellers who looked lost or searching or open to conversation. Most people avoided him. He looked like what he was, a broken man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, speaking in a monotone about verses and visions and seeing God. Some people listened for a moment before making excuses and walking away quickly. Some told him to get lost, threatened to call the police if he didn't stop harassing customers. Some saw the Bible in his hands and their faces went pale, and they ran to their cars without saying a word. But a few people listened, really listened. And James told them his story in that flat, emotionless voice, described the preacher and the Bible and the torn page, and what happened when you completed the verse. He warned them to never accept free Bibles from strangers, to never finish verses they didn't understand, to never pray for things they weren't prepared to receive. Word spread through Little Rock about the crazy man outside the gas stations, the one who warned people about Bibles and preachers and seeing God. Most people dismissed him as mentally ill, as just another unfortunate soul who'd lost their grip on reality. The local police picked him up twice for loitering, drove him to the edge of town and told him not to come back. He came back anyway. James's friends from his old life tried to reach him. They'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd had some kind of breakdown, that he'd lost his job and his apartment, and was living on the streets in Arkansas. They called the disconnected phone number. They sent emails to an address he never checked. A few of them even drove down to Little Rock to find him. When they saw him, they barely recognized the man they'd known. James had been friendly, quick to laugh, engaged with life despite his aimless drifting. This person, who looked like James but moved like a sleepwalker, was someone completely different. Hollow. Empty. His eyes had a 1,000-yard stare that never ended, looking through people, instead of at them, seeing something far beyond the physical world that everyone else inhabited. His friends tried to help. They offered him money, offered to drive him home, offered to get him into treatment. James refused everything with that flat, emotionless voice. He told them he couldn't leave Little Rock yet. He had work to do. When they asked what work, he just held up the Bible and said he had to warn people. His friends eventually gave up, disturbed and heartbroken, unable to reach whatever was left of the person they'd known. 6 weeks after completing the verse, James encountered someone who changed everything. A journalist passing through Little Rock on assignment heard about the man outside the gas stations warning people about Bibles. The journalist's name was Marcus Webb, and he was driving from Memphis to Dallas when he stopped for gas and saw James standing in the parking lot, holding his leather-bound Bible like a shield against invisible horrors. Marcus approached him the way journalists approach potential stories, curious, slightly skeptical, but willing to listen. He asked James what he was warning people about, and James, for the first time since completing the verse, told his story in full. They sat in Marcus's car for over 2 hours. James spoke in that same monotone voice, never making eye contact, staring straight ahead through the windshield, as he described everything: the preacher at the gas station, the Bible with the torn page, the 3 weeks of obsession, the old woman who'd seen God 40 years ago and prayed for blindness ever since, the moment he completed the verse, and what he'd seen when he turned around. Marcus listened without interrupting, taking notes on his phone, recording the conversation with James's permission. He'd interviewed hundreds of people over his career: conspiracy theorists, cult survivors, people who claimed alien abduction or government persecution. He'd learned to identify genuine delusion versus manufactured stories, and something about James's account struck him as different. It wasn't that Marcus believed the supernatural elements. He didn't. But he believed that James absolutely, completely believed them. There was no performance in his telling, no dramatic embellishment, no attention-seeking behaviour. James spoke like someone giving testimony at a trial, recounting facts he wished desperately weren't true. When James finished his account, Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did James regret it? Did he regret finishing the verse? For the first time in the entire conversation, James looked directly at Marcus, and Marcus would later tell other journalists that those eyes were the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen in 20 years of reporting. Not because they were crazy, but because they were too sane, too aware, too burdened with a weight that no human consciousness was meant to carry. James's answer came out in that same flat monotone, but the words themselves carried the weight of absolute truth, spoken by someone who'd paid the highest possible price to learn it. He told Marcus that he'd seen God, that he'd asked for it, prayed for it, obsessed over it, and finally gotten exactly what he'd wanted. And now he could never unsee what he'd seen. He explained that the preacher was still out there, still in Little Rock, still handing out those Bibles with missing pages, still waiting patiently for the next person who was desperate enough, or curious enough, or faithful enough to complete the verse. James's final words to Marcus were simple and devastating. He told him not to be that person. Don't accept free Bibles from strangers. Don't finish verses you don't understand. Don't pray for revelations you're not prepared to receive. Because some prayers are answered. Sometimes God actually responds. And you'll spend every remaining moment of your existence wishing with everything you have that he hadn't. Marcus published the story 3 weeks later in a long-form journalism magazine. It was titled, "The Man Who Saw God and Lost His Mind." The article went viral, racked up millions of views, spawned countless Reddit threads and YouTube videos and podcast discussions. Most people read it as a cautionary tale about mental illness and religious obsession. Some read it as an elaborate creepypasta, fiction disguised as journalism. A few read it as truth and stayed the hell away from Little Rock, Arkansas. Marcus tried to contact James after the article published, wanted to follow up, see how he was doing. But James had vanished. No one at the gas stations had seen him in weeks. The motels where he'd stayed had no forwarding information. It was as if he'd simply disappeared, his warning delivered and his purpose fulfilled. Some people claim they've seen him. A gaunt man with hollow eyes standing outside gas stations in other cities, other states, always holding a leather-bound Bible, always warning travellers about completing verses. Whether these sightings are real or just urban legend, no one can say for certain. But the preacher is still out there, still in Little Rock, still handing out Bibles with torn pages and that same soft-spoken promise. Finish the verse, and you'll see God. So if you ever find yourself in Little Rock, Arkansas, and a soft-spoken preacher with a too-practiced smile approaches you with a leather-bound Bible, do what James Holbrook couldn't do. Say no, walk away, and never look back. Because finishing that verse doesn't show you God, it shows you why humanity invented blindness as a mercy.